What happens when one man tries to watch all of the horror films of the 1940s? Well, we're about to find out because I'm your host, Josh Spiegel, and this is the 40s Project. Welcome to the 40s Project, and I think we're going to find that this is very different than the 1930s, considering that the Hays Code was in full effect. So things are going to get a little less scary and a little more goofy. And unlike the 30s Project, there's going to be a couple of years here that will require multiple episodes. So it'll be a little bit longer, but even then, it's still, I think, only going to be about 12 or 13 episodes. So not very long. But there's a lot of really great stuff in this decade. So let's dive right in and find out what the 40s were all about.
Our first film of the 1940s arrived on January 12th, and it was one of the biggest films of the year and a Universal Monsters staple, with The Invisible Man Returns. It begins with everyone discussing a man who is going to be executed for killing his brother, but they all say he didn't do it. There's a man here named Frank Griffin, and he goes to see Radcliffe on death row, and mysteriously, shortly after, he vanishes. Of course, he's now invisible and a fugitive, and Griffin seems to know a little something about it. A police officer says that 9 years ago, a man named John Griffin was able to turn himself invisible and was killed after his crime spree, and was Richard's brother, so he's curious if he's tried to perfect his bro's formula. Jeffrey shows up at his fiancee's place all wrapped up, and if his voice sounds familiar, well, it's none other than the great Vincent Price himself in one of his earlier roles, and his first appearance on the project, except he showed up one time in the 80s project, but in terms of the 30s and 40s, chronologically, it's his first time here. He seems really irritable, and they're aware that the formula takes a toll on the subject's sanity, and Richard is attempting to come up with an antidote before that happens. He pulls off the bandages, and yep, he's invisible all right, with slightly upgraded effects from the original. Jeff's cousin is Cedric Hardwicke, who we just saw in 1939 in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and there's also the vagrant Willie Spears, and this is Alan Napier, otherwise known as the 60s Alfred Pennyworth. And of course, this is a sequel to the 1933 film The Invisible Man, although no actors from the original return, and the main link is Griffin's little brother continuing his work. The director was a man named Joe May, and this is his first appearance on the project, as he mainly did crime stories, and most of his work was in Germany, and he actually spoke no English. Early on in the production, they had said that either Boris Karloff or Bela Lugosi would be coming in to be the Invisible Man, although that didn't pan out. Price and Hardwicke had just been in a movie called Tower of London, a historical film, and they liked their work together, so they were brought on here, which was fortuitous because Price spoke German and would translate the director's notes to the cast. It had a shrunken budget of $243K and only a 27-day shooting window, and with such complicated special effects, that made for a stressful shoot. It ended up being a solid hit, earning $800,000 in ticket sales, and the reviews were pretty favorable. It would also go on to earn an Oscar nomination for Best Special Effects, but would lose to Thief of Baghdad. And this is a fun start to all of this, and it gets a 3.5 out of 5. Price is fantastic in the role, and the shift from a psycho invisible man to someone trying to clear his name works really well. Its significance is just a 3 though, since it's not the most known take on the character, and most of the relevance stems from the OG, but it was Price's first horror work and a notable Universal monster. Should you watch it? Yep, unwrap it. We're going to bounce on over to the UK now, because our next entry comes on February 27th there, and would get a US release in January of 42, and it's Crimes at the Dark House. This one starts in Australia, as a man is murdered, and the guy who does it has a very familiar cackle. And yep, what do you know? English horror, Todd Slaughter. The man he killed has an inheritance letter on him, so he takes his identity and heads to England to collect. Unfortunately, he finds out that all that was left to the guy was a large debt, but also an offer to marry the daughter of a rich man. But trouble arises when a woman appears and claims to have a secret child with Percival and knows that this guy ain't him. And then the woman promised to him is in love with another man. But then things get crazier when it turns out that the secret child hates him and is coming to get him. And his tryst with a chambermaid gets out of hand, and the fake Percival has to start killing anyone that seems to threaten his true identity coming out, making sure to do the slaughter laugh the whole time. And this is yet another entry from George King, who has worked with Slaughter several times, and I featured the pair on the 30s project with the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, Ticket of Leave Man, and The Face at the Window. The original title for this was The Woman in White, and it was based on a novel of that name from 1860, which has been adapted quite a few times before and after this. It's starting to become standard issue for Slaughter to be in a plot in which he's concealing his true identity and trying to win over a much younger woman who is already entangled with someone else. The story it's based on doesn't feature this character nearly as much, so it's been greatly altered to accommodate a bigger role for our fiendish killer. And this is pretty fun. It's a 3. It feels a bit like the other Slaughter movies, but there's enough distinct to set it apart. Its significance is just a 1 though, since it's not well known and didn't have much impact at all. Should you watch it? Probably. This house is worth a quick visit.
You always said you were a teetotaler. You're going to have a nice drop. Now.
We are back in the States now for a film that debuted in West Virginia on April 4th, and it sounds like a sequel to a film from the early days of the 30s project with Son of Engagi. When Eleanor and Bob get married, Dr. Helen Jackson asks her attorney to come over and help her to change her will.
Now tell me that old lady's got enough money to burn up a wet mule.
Is that a saying? Is that expensive? I've never wanted to burn any mule before, let alone a wet one. So I guess I'm just not aware of current pricing.
Meanwhile, at the wedding party, a musical number.
Here's one thing you must know, that you can't run with us no more. So long, old pal, so long, goodbye. Perhaps we'll meet again on high.
While Helen peeps in on them, but there's an explosion outside. When everyone goes to check it out, Eleanor stays behind and Helen confesses that she was in love with her father. Later on, Helen's brother confronts her about missing gold, and she introduces him to Engagi, an ape-man monster that she brought back from her from a trip to Africa. She's also working on some sort of formula which he drinks and then goes mad and kills her, but since she's changed her will, Eleanor and Bob inherit her house and move in, not knowing that Engagi still lives in the cellar and can be summoned through the banging of a gong, kind of like T-Rex. And this one is from Richard C. Kahn, and he did a number of films around this era that had a pretty niche role. And you see, this film features an entirely black cast, and was the first horror film to do so. In fact, a number of Kahn's films would feature an all-black ensemble, something that was very rare at the time, although the director himself was white. And although this film is called Son of Engagi, there was a film from 1930 called Engagi, but there's no connection between the two. In fact, the script was adapted from a short story called House of Horror, and it's generally assumed that the title was altered to insinuate a connection between it and the earlier film to increase ticket sales. And this is a little on the dull side, so I'll give it a 2.5. I enjoy the beginning quite a bit, and the finale is kind of fun. It's just the middle portion that really lags. Its significance is a 2, since it is fairly obscure and unheard of, but it has some merit due to being the first horror film with an all-black cast. Should you watch it? I think it deserves a watch. It's definitely better than the film it's claimed to be a sequel to. This next one came out on April 12th and is 2 words that anyone who has ever worked a day of retail will dread hearing, and it's Black Friday. Not the Bruce Campbell film from 2021, though. Instead, this one has a man being led to his execution, and it's Boris Karloff for his first appearance in the 40s, and surely not his last. He gives his private notes to a reporter that he says was fair to him, and it shows his story in flashback, which starts on a Friday the 13th, of course. There's this professor, Mr. Kingsley, and he's retiring, and he's friends with Karloff's Sovak, but is then run over during a gunfight between criminals in cars. One of them is Bela Lugosi for his first appearance of the 40s, also nowhere near his last. Ernest realizes that he can save his friend's life by doing a brain transplant using the gangster from the car that ran him down, and does it. But when it turns out that the mob guy had a stash of hidden money, Ernie believes that parts of his brain may be able to recall where it's located. He takes him to New York, and sure enough, he seems to have flashes of familiarity, and is even able to talk to Red while he's in a trance-like state as his shifts starts to get more and more extreme. And this one is from Arthur Lublin, a pretty prolific director. In fact, this was one of 6 films that he made in 1940 alone, although he only dipped into horror on occasion. The script was by Kurt Siodmak, and he also wrote The Invisible Man Returns and several other films we'll see this year. And what's interesting is that he was apparently really into this whole idea of a transplanted brain, since he would revisit it with Donovan's brain and Hauser's memory. Another interesting bit is that the original title for the movie was Friday the 13th, but it was changed during the filming process. Siodmak claimed that the part of Red Cannon was originally intended for Karloff to play, and Lugosi was meant to play Sovak, but he says that Karloff was afraid of the role and that it required too much acting, and requested to play the Doctor instead. Lugosi, instead of getting the dual role, was then shifted into the minor part of the gangster, although no reason is given. There is some serious doubt as to the screenwriter's story, mostly because Karloff has played dual roles on multiple occasions, including in The Black Room. It is known, however, that the actors did indeed swap roles, but the reasoning for it is what's in question. And this is fine. I give it a 3, but mostly for Stanley Ridge's double performance, which is pretty killer, although the plot feels a bit standard. Its significance is just a 1.5 since it's not really all that known, but it does have Karloff and Lugosi in it, even if just for a little bit. Should you watch it? I'd say yeah, it's an interesting story and does some fun stuff.
What business could you have with Marty?
You better come along with us and explain that to the DA.
This next one is another that came out on April 12th, but it did have a premiere 2 days earlier on the 10th, and it's one I'm excited about, and it's Dr. Cyclops. We meet the good, or I guess not so good Doc, and actually Dr. Thorkel, and he's working on something that Dr. Mendoza disagrees with, so he kills him. And look at this glorious Technicolor. And unlike Dr. X and Mystery of the Wax Museum, you'll notice more variation in that color, and we'll discuss that shortly. The doc summons a number of biologists up to his camp out in Peru, and he needs their help because his eyesight has gotten so bad that he can't use the microscope anymore. But then dismisses them very shortly afterwards, which doesn't sit well with them. That night, it's discovered that he has a miniature horse, and they confront him in his fancy linen suit, and yeah, man, that's the problem with wearing linen. It's gonna get all wrinkled like that. And when he invites them to see his new creation, he surprises them by turning it on. And it turns out that his whole thing is shrinking people down to about a foot tall. They then attempt to escape, but also have to avoid his cat, which keeps eyeing them up like tiny toga-clad snacks. And I love that they're all like, we're basically making dresses and toga and the like, but this one guy is like, nah, I'm just making a diaper, deal with it. And meanwhile, if you're like, hey, this guy has bad eyesight, that doesn't make him a Cyclops. The movie actually explains that, since the Cyclops of legend thinks that size beats intellect, and they're making the same claim about him. And this is another one from Ernest Schoedsack, whose work showed up a few times in the 30s Project with The Most Dangerous Game and Son of Kong, and he was an uncredited director on King Kong as well, and uses several of the same effects techniques here, and he would only do 2 more films after this one. It was the very first sci-fi/horror picture to be shot with 3-strip Technicolor. The earlier ones that I mentioned used a two-color process, only greens and reds. But this new process added blues to give a wider range of tones. And I said I'm excited to talk about this one, and that's because this used to be on TV all the time on Saturday morning when I was growing up. They would show older sci-fi and horror flicks, and I would watch them. And I've seen this a handful of times, but not for ages. And it did quite well when it came out, although there's no box office numbers listed. But it did get nominated for an Oscar for Best Special Effects, where it competed against The Invisible Man Returns, but did not win. And this is a 3.5. My nostalgia is strong, but it's really not all that good. Albert Dekker as Cyclops is pretty great though, but the story gets a bit monotonous. Its significance is a 2.5 since it's not all that well known and doesn't really feature any horror stars, but it does have some name recognition and an Oscar nomination, plus the distinction of being the first genre film in full color. Should you watch it? Yes, the Doctor's in.
And that is something which I cannot permit.
Moving into June now, and on the 21st, there was a fun release that got a premiere a little earlier on the 7th, but the 21st was the full release, and it's The Ghost Breakers. There's a big storm and a citywide blackout, and Mary here is given a deed to a property on an island as an inheritance that's said to be haunted. There's a radio station run by Bob Hope, and his assistant is Willie Best, who we haven't seen on here since 1932 in The Monster Walks, but he was very busy in the comedy world. He gets a tip from a mobster friend named Raspy, and he's doing an expose on a boss named Frenchie, who's pretty unhappy about it. When they try to take him out, he takes refuge in Mary's apartment and hides in her trunk, and is accidentally shipped to the island. On the ship over, Mary gets a threat, and Larry decides to help her, claiming to be a ghost breaker, and plans to figure out what the deal is. Oh, and by the way, Mary is played by Paulette Goddard, who we just saw co-star with Hope in The Cat and the Canary, and immediately after this she'd go on to appear in the awesome Chaplin flick, The Great Dictator. Before they get to the island, it's pretty clear that someone is trying to prevent them from getting there, and when they do get there, it turns out that zombies are involved. But of course, voodoo-style zombies as opposed to actual Walking Dead. And this was based on a play from 1909 called The Ghost Breaker, and this was actually the third version of it, with the first being all the way back in 1914 and the second in 1922, and is said to be an inspiration for Ghostbusters. The director is George Marshall, and he'd revisit this one a little later in the 50s with a remake called Scare Stiff that would instead star Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. This one was fast-tracked because of the success of The Cat and the Canary, and Paramount wanted to capitalize on that by getting another spooky ghost story with Hope and Goddard going. And that paid off because this one was beloved by critics and audiences alike, and it was a massive hit. It was such a big success that everyone and their mother tried to get in on the action by making their own ghost-busting movie, with some featuring Best appearing again as a character very similar to the one he's playing here. And this is pretty fun. I give it a 3. It's entertaining, but it takes them so damn long to get to the island that it's mostly unclear just what the whole point of the movie is, and by the time that the actual plot kicks in, the movie's almost done. Its significance is a 2.5 since it's not exactly a household name, but it has had a larger than usual influence on the ghost comedy genre and features some quality name stars. Should you watch it? Yeah. Who are you gonna call? Ghost Breakers.
Hey, boss, you ain't going upstairs, are you? Where does Ghost is?
Listen, you stay there. And if a couple of fellas come running down the stairs in a few minutes, let the first one go. That'll be me.
We're jumping ahead to September 17th now and checking out one that's going to feel a bit familiar, and it's called Before I Hang. This begins with Boris Karloff, again, and he's on trial for a crime, this time doing a mercy killing on an old and suffering friend, but the judges sentence him to death. And geez, in how many movies does Karloff go to jail or get a death penalty? Like, he just got executed in Black Friday, and I'm pretty sure I've seen at least 2 movies in the 30s project with the same setup. His prison warden is intrigued by the doc's ideas about stopping the effects of ages, as he thinks that he can stop cells from decaying, and they allow him to continue working up until his hanging. He does tests with this thing. What is this? Was he like, I need an anatomical model with a pumping heart, but I need one as disturbing looking as I can get? It should look like Howdy Doody frozen in carbonite. When they finally finish his anti-aging serum on the day of his hanging, they figure that they can just test it on him, since he'll be dead soon anyway. But then, right before walking that last mile, he's given a commuted sentence of serving life, which is daunting for someone who's just taken an anti-aging serum. But next, the plot thickens when it turns out that the formula used the blood of a murderer, and we all know that the urge to kill can be found in the blood. So Garth begins to attack. But another prisoner is blamed for the murder, so he's set free? He becomes obsessed with helping his aging friend by also giving them the serum, but will his murderous blood get the best of him? And the director here is Nick Grind, and oddly enough, he also directed Karloff back in 1939 with The Man They Could Not Hang, which was one of those other films I was talking about earlier with Karloff on death row. And this was actually the second film of what is referred to as Karloff's Mad Doctor Cycle. He made several films in a row in which he was sort of a crazed murderous scientist, and we'll cover the other ones as we moved on through the decade. It was originally titled The Wizard of Death and made by Columbia Pictures, and Karloff was under contract with them at the time. And this is just a 2.5 for me. It feels a little bit old hat at this point, and this really isn't a sequel to The Man They Could Not Hang, but it sure does kind of feel like it, or a remake or something. And it really feels like watching the same movie again, even if the circumstances are different. Its HCS is a 1.5, since it's also not really that heard of, but it has Karloff in it, even if it's one of his less noted roles. Should you watch it? You can probably leave it hanging.
George, don't. Don't touch that. I don't want to hurt you. George, don't.
This may be the big one because on September 20th, we had the return of the Universal horror icon, The Mummy, with The Mummy's Hand. It begins with the High Priest of Karnak, who is on his last legs, so he summons his son, Andoheb, and shows him the death of Princess Ananka from 3,000 years ago. Prince Karis was secretly in love with her and doesn't take her death well, so he steals the forbidden Tana leaves with the hope of bringing her back. He gets busted though and is buried alive as a mummy, but they bury the leaves with him, which seems like, I don't know, not a good idea. He then shows Ando how to restore Karis and then dies. Meanwhile, Steve and his silly sidekick Babe are in Egypt and they've been fired by the museum that they've been working for. But their luck changes when they find a vase that they think reveals the location of Ananka's tomb. They see Andoheb and he tries to convince them that the vase is fake, but they decide to move forward anyway and find it. They find funding from a stage magician and his daughter who come along with them into the desert, and they discover the tomb. But instead of finding the princess, they uncover Karis himself. Andoheb shows up there, and sure enough, a little while later, the mummy comes to life and goes on a rampage. And I suppose this is a sequel of sorts to The Mummy from 1932, although it's completely unconnected except for having a mummy as the main villain of the film. Although this is more of the classic wrapped-up guy that you'd expect, unlike the first one. After the success of Son of Frankenstein and The Invisible Man Returns, it seemed like sequels were the way to go for Universal, and they pushed this through with a lower budget of $84K, and made sure to reuse footage from the other film, and also the score from Son of Frankenstein in order to save money. One thing they didn't skimp on, though, was the villain himself, as they did some extensive makeup work on his face with gluing little strips of cotton there, giving the look of aged wrinkles. And then, in close-ups, they actually went frame by frame and hand-colored them to black out his eyes and mouth to give them a spookier look. And this is a step in the right direction from the original one, but it's still not a great film, but I give it a 3.5. I like that it features more of the mummy that I want to see, but it takes him so damn long to show up. The significance is a 4, though, since this is most what people think of when they picture this particular character, and it's the first time that we're really getting it. Should you watch it? Yes, it's a part of that great Universal vibe. A week or so later, on September 30th, we're looking at our next entry on the Karloffapalooza that was this year with The Ape. We start with a bunch of punk kids causing trouble by throwing rocks at the house of a doctor that they say is mad and smash his windows. He's got that sort of lab that I'm pretty sure only existed in movies, and he's determined to cure a local girl of her polio paralysis, because polio used to be a thing. And good job, America. Let's make it a comeback. The circus is in town, and they have this big gorilla named Nabu, and he attacks a guy, which starts a fire, and it escapes. The doc figures out that the answer to his serum is using human spinal fluid, and prepares to try it out on Francis. But that night, Nabu gets into his lab and destroys all of the fluid he needs before the doc can kill him. Turns out that Adrian was fired because of his unauthorized experiments, but when he's looking like a suspect as to why there's so many corpses missing spinal fluid, he starts to wear the skin of the gorilla around town to make people believe that Nabu is responsible, which is pretty weird, right? And this one was by William Nye. And we haven't encountered him since 1934 with The House of Mystery, which coincidentally also featured a giant killer ape. In fact, this film was adapted from the same play as that one was, also called The Ape. This was from Monogram Pictures, and Karloff had a 6-picture deal with them, and the first 5 were all as a character called Detective Lee Wong, but then ended up recasting that role with an actual Asian man and hired Key Luke, otherwise known as the shopkeeper from Gremlins, or the guy who says, "Hi-ya." So this movie ended Karloff's contract. They actually tailored the plot to be similar to the Mad Doctor movies that Karloff was doing over at Columbia, so even though this isn't a part of that whole Mad Doctor cycle thing, it may as well be. The reviews weren't all that bad, actually, when it got some positive marks, although it hasn't aged well and feels rather lightweight compared to the other Karloff flicks from the same time, even though those were also pretty low-key. And in a year that features some clunkers of Karloff, this may take the cake. So it's just a 2 from me. It has some fun moments, and anytime you've got big silly gorilla stuff, I'm slightly entertained. But for a movie called The Ape, there sure ain't much ape. Its significance is only a 1.5 since it blends in with most of the other Boris movies with a similar theme, but it's still a Karloff flick. Should you watch it? I'd skip this one and go to the zoo instead.
Doctor! Look out, Doctor! The ape! The ape! Doctor, the ape! Doctor!
We're all the way into November now, and on the 22nd there was another mix of horror and comedy with You'll Find Out. It begins with everyone talking about the music of Kay Kaiser. He actually was a band leader at the time and plays himself in the film. After a big show, he's introduced to a woman whose party he's going to play at, and it seems like someone is trying to kill her, and her boyfriend Chuck is going to figure out what's going on. The party is at a big old spooky mansion, and the whole band arrives. There, Kay meets Janice's Aunt Margot, who claims to talk to the dead. And then, holy crap, Karloff is here too. That's the 4th movie this year to feature him. But he's not the only one here, since Bella pops in too. And this is his 2nd appearance this year so far. And as I've mentioned before, the pair had a pretty notorious rivalry with each other, and yet appeared together fairly frequently, although they would only be in one more film together after this one. Kay starts seeing spooky stuff around the house, and the drawbridge to the castle, the one way to get in or out, is mysteriously blown up. Next up, right before the bridge fell, a professor who studies spiritualists arrives, and it's Peter Lorre. So this has some powerhouse horror star quality going on, and both Lugosi and Lorre were from Hungary, and this would be the only film that they would appear in together, although Karloff and Laurie would co-star several more times. So, Kay starts to realize that something fishy is going on and tries to get to the bottom of who is trying to take advantage of Aunt Margot. And this one is from David Butler, and is the first time he's showing up on the project, but he was very active director and continued on into the 60s. This was done on a moderate budget of $371,000 and used some cost-cutting measures like reusing some props and recycled quite a bit from King Kong. It was a sort of vehicle for Kaiser, as his band had a successful radio show at the time, and this was an attempt to cross him over into the film world. Although this was the second film to feature him and his band, and he'd go on to do several more films. Upon release, it was a nice-sized hit, earning around $1 million, and was also nominated for an Academy Award for Best Original Song, but lost to When You Wish Upon a Star from Pinocchio. And yeah, I mean, this is fine. It's a 2.5 for me. Kind of standard haunted mansion story. And Kaiser is likely a better band leader than a comic actor, because I wasn't feeling him here. Its significance is a 2, since it's never really spoken of and didn't really impact the genre, but was successful and featured 3 major players. Should you watch it? You could probably skip it. Getting near the end of the year now, and we go to December 13th for this next one, although it did have a premiere a little earlier on November 11th, but it's The Devil Bat. This gives us a doctor in the town of Heathville, and it's Lugosi again for appearance number 3 in 1940, and he's doing tests with a bat, and through glandular stimulation, he's increased its size dramatically. He rigs it up in this Frankenstein-looking lab, and I guess shocks the poor guy, and I have to say, Bella is rocking a Mr. Rogers look in a big way here, although Fred would never approve of training oversized bats to kill his enemies. His plan is pretty over-elaborate, though, as he creates a new type of aftershave that he convinces people to put on, and the bat then comes after that person and kills them, which is original? A reporter comes in to investigate with a tie he borrowed from the Riddler, and he's the first one to determine that a bat may be involved in the killing, while it continues its rampage and has the most hilarious scream as it does. So, I should point out that in this era, just like now, there were major studio players, but also lower budget films produced by smaller studios. These were often referred to as Poverty Row films or studios, and most of these films were westerns or crime stories. Several companies would pop up and churn these out, and a new one on the scene was called PRC, and this would be their first horror film. This was the era when Lugosi was a bit down and out and was starting to make a slight comeback, and PRC slapped him up to appear here. The film's protagonist, reporter Johnny Layton, is played by Dave O'Brien, and he had previously appeared in the rather infamous anti-drug film from 1936, Reefer Madness. His goofy sidekick is Donald Kerr, although Flash Gordon fans will recognize him as Happy Hapgood from the classic Serial. It was actually quite a big hit from PRC and was their biggest money-making film, so much so that they went back to the well to do a sequel a few years later with a film called The Devil Bat's Daughter, although it failed to make the same mark as this one did. There was also a sort of unofficial sequel of sorts that was released in 2015 called Revenge of the Devil Bat by low-budget filmmaker Ted Moring, the director of Camp Blood 6. Because of the somewhat low-end nature of the studio, they neglected to renew the film's copyright, so it slipped into public domain, making it available for anyone to release or distribute. And this is another 2.5. I love how ridiculous that the whole concept is with the bat attacking aftershave stuff, but it's kind of repetitive and just doesn't do enough with it. The HCS is a 2 since it's not also well known, but does have some name recognition and Lugosi's in it. Should you watch it? Perhaps it's amusing enough, but just not really something you can't live without seeing. Our final film of the year could actually be on here a bit earlier since it premiered in the UK on May 31st and then got a run there on October 12th, but it ran in the US on December 20th. and it's The Door with the Seven Locks, also called The Chamber of Horrors. It has Lord Charles here, and he's on his deathbed and has made his final arrangements for his estate and discusses that his money should go to his child, but his jewels will be buried with him, and there will be 7 locks that must be fastened after his death. Their keys are given to a doctor that he trusts, and his servants seem a bit shady, but young John is given the riches. After he passes, the door is all locked up, and time passes, and the keys are all then sent out to various people. When John is visited by June, the next in line for the fortune, he tries to tell her where the final key is and is killed, and his body vanishes. This sets her on the hunt to find the remaining keys and solve the mystery of what's going on, and that takes her to Dr. Minetta, played by Leslie Banks, who was the villainous Count Zaroff way back in The Most Dangerous Game. He seems to know more than he's letting on, and has a literal museum of torture devices in his basement and a weird fascination with Torquemada. But who has the keys? Who's doing that killing? What's in that chamber? Well, the answers come from Norman Lee, and this was the first thing that he did that would fall under the horror-adjacent category, but he'll show up again before the ending of the decade. It's a British film, and at the time, the British Board of Film Censors were pretty active, and up until the mid-30s, there was a ban on any films that featured supernatural horror or broad general horror-themed films. So outside of the earlier Todd Slaughter films that we've covered here, this was one of the first. It adapts a novel from 1926 called The Door with the Seven Locks, and the other British horror flick The Human Monster, which I covered in the 1939 movies, was based on a work from the same author. That author, by the way, was Edgar Wallace, a man who had a huge list of his works turned into films, most of which were in a silent era, but he's also the man who wrote the screenplay for King Kong. After its UK release, it was quickly picked up by the American company Monogram and given a release here as Chamber of Horrors, although that version runs around 10 minutes shorter. And this is okay, this is another 2.5. I really liked the setup and seemed like it was going to turn into a cool story, but then it just seemed to lose track of what it was about. Its significance is just a 1 since it's fairly unknown and didn't really kick off any careers or push the genre anywhere new. Should you watch it? I mean, it's not awful, but I would still leave this door locked.
Be careful.
So there you have it, the beginning of the year there for 1940, and some pretty strong contenders, but I think my favorite of this batch is probably going to be The Invisible Man Returns. It's just a lot of fun. I think it's a great follow-up to the original and does some things that I really enjoy. But let me know which are your favorite down below. Let me know which of these you've seen, which of these you haven't seen, and which one of these you'd now like to see. Tell me that down below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. Hit the subscribe button if you enjoyed the channel. And also, check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines and help keep the projects going. And they're going to keep on going because we're just chugging through the decades. Starting it up right now on the 40s Project.